Hi, I'm Maren and welcome back to my channel, Maren Makes It. Today I'm here with part 2 to my camping and traveling alone safety tips series. If you missed part 1, no worries, you can totally watch this one first and then go back and watch part 2. These tips won't really build on the ones from the first video. I'm just going to be starting at number 9, so if you're wondering why that's happening, that would be why. I'll make sure to link part 1 in the description down below and also at the end of this video so you can watch that one next easily. If you did watch part 1, then thank you so much for coming back to my channel. Your support really means a lot to me, especially as I'm trying to grow my channel. Of course, I saved a lot of my most creative safety tips for last, so those are the ones that are going to end up being in this video. I'm even going to include a few personal stories in order to help illustrate some of these tips. So we left off at number 8 at the end of the last video, so here we go, starting with tip number 9. My 9th tip is to assess the safety of the neighborhood by watching people's behavior in grocery stores. So I know this sounds kind of weird, but grocery stores are a great place to do this because generally the people in grocery stores are not tourists. They're people who actually live in that area and know that area well. What you want to do is you want to look at what people do with their purses when they're in the grocery store. So do they leave them sitting in the cart like the way where that little baby sitting spot is? Do they like hold on to them while they go to the shelf and pick out their groceries? Do they kind of hide them under their coats? Like, what are the behaviors of women with their purses in the grocery store? This is a great indicator of how safe the neighborhood is because when you're in a not safe place or in a kind of more metro area, people are really cautious about kind of like holding onto their purses while they go to the shelf and grab something, even if they're willing to leave their cart behind and turn their back on their cart. Whereas when you're in a really safe area, you'll notice that people will turn their back on their cart with their purse in it. So my tip is to watch people's behavior there. That's a huge indicator of how safe the area is that you're in. If this is an idea you would have never thought of, then before you forget, please hit the like button down below. It really helps YouTube to recommend this video to other people who are interested in car camping and traveling and similar content. Tip number 10, I think we're on 10, is to be cautious about who you tell what information to. So if you haven't noticed, I'm a pretty chatty person and I love meeting new people. So I would be very tempted to meet new people as I was traveling, especially when I was by myself. I love talking to people on hikes, and sometimes I'd end up even hiking with them. At one point I had somebody and I bond over a woodchuck, and then we ended up doing like a 5-mile hike together. There's a lot of great stories and connections you can make along the way while traveling. However, you do want to be careful about where you're doing this and also what you're telling to whom. So I would usually be really chatty with people when I was on trails or maybe in city areas, but in campgrounds, I really kept to myself and I really didn't want to draw any extra attention to the fact that I was a woman traveling alone and sleeping in my car. My 11th tip is to put duct tape on the dashboard of your car. I know this sounds super weird, but I have duct tape on the dashboard of my car because of the way I put the Christmas lights up in the inside of my car. I also, for a while, thought I had a mouse in my car, so I actually duct taped the air vents closed temporarily in order to make sure the mouse stayed in the engine and didn't come into the car with me where I was sleeping because I have a weird fear of mice. But I realized that this actually makes your car look kind of run down, let's put it that way. When somebody looks in your car and is like, wow, that person's car is literally being held together by duct tape, I think they're not very likely to suspect that you have valuables in the car. So at least for me, my car was always jam-packed full, and I was really lucky that in 10,000 miles nobody broke into my car, and I wonder if duct tape was part of the reason for this. If you don't have a practical reason to have duct tape on your car, you could definitely still put a piece of it somewhere or put a piece of it on even like a seat or something, just to kind of make your car look a little bit more run down. Because I do think that when somebody looks in your car and sees all that, they're going to see, wow, there's a lot of stuff in the car, but it's also kind of in rundown shape. Probably the type of car that you have here also affects it. I think certain cars, people are not going to be likely to believe that that duct tape is really doing anything, but it's something to think about. My 12th tip is to get a good night's sleep. I know this is the kind of advice that might make you want to roll your eyes, but before you click out of this video, hang with me. Sleep is so big for your mood, your reaction time, your memory, your ability to focus, your ability to concentrate, that I really think this one is something that you shouldn't underestimate. So according to the CDC, studies have shown that lack of sleep can affect your driving similar to alcohol, and being awake for 24 hours straight is equivalent to having a blood alcohol content of 0.1%, which would qualify you as a drunk driver in every state of the US. So if you sleep for just 6 hours and you're awake for 18 hours straight, that's equivalent to having a reaction time similar to somebody who has a blood alcohol content of 0.05. So 0.08 is in most states the legal limit to be considered a drunk driver. So you're already more than halfway there just because you got 6 hours of sleep. That's crazy to me, but then it's kind of true when I think about how I am when I am sleep deprived. I'm in a way worse mood. I'm way more impatient, so probably more likely to make bad driving choices. I feel kind of slower, and the thing is, it's one thing to feel slower in your regular day, but when it comes to driving, those like seconds or milliseconds difference between like you slamming on the brakes or changing lanes to avoid something, that could be the difference between a car crash and not a car crash, and basically life or death. Sleep is a huge one here for your safety. There was times on my trip where I had slept really poorly, where I would say that my biggest vulnerability for something happening to me, whether that's kind of stranger danger or somebody approaching me, or also like a driving error, my biggest vulnerability was sleep deprivation and being exhausted, honestly. One great example of this, if you guys want to hear a funny story, is that I was in the woods camping. I had driven to the bathroom there and I managed to lock my keys in the car because I had not properly propped the door. One of the doors in my car closes like really easily, and it was very windy that day, so I should have known better to prop the door of the car, and I ended up not. And then I was in the woods without service, locked out of my car, freezing cold, like I was just running to the bathroom. I hadn't even taken my jacket out of the car or anything. In that case, it was fine because I was totally safe, and it wasn't really so much a question of my safety, it was more a question of an inconvenience. But being exhausted can lead to a lot more of these inconveniences starting to happen to you. If you want another example of how silly mistakes with sleep deprivation can happen, I was once at a Walmart. I was checking out at the self-checkout, and I ended up leaving one of the bags at the self-checkout counter. I didn't realize this until about an hour later when I was driving, and I wanted one of those things in the bag. This was super frustrating and obviously just a waste of money. However, you can see how these kind of little mistakes that you're more likely to make when you're sleepy, if you make them in the wrong situations, you could easily end up putting your safety or even your life in harm's way. Sleep affects your memory, mood, concentration, fine motor skills, so it's really not just a question of your safety, but it's also a question of how much you're going to be able to enjoy things, because it's really hard to enjoy, going on an adventure or going on a hike when you're tired the whole time. So my next tip is to put all your valuables in the trunk of your car, especially if you have a sedan. Nobody can see into the trunk of your car, and you can lock it as a separate compartment from the rest of the car. So I highly recommend doing this. If you're like me though, and you have a lot more stuff than fits in the trunk of your car, you'll end up having to keep some of it on the back seat. Obviously, this is going to be visible to people who are walking by your car when you're parked, or even just looking in while they're driving. In order to keep that stuff organized and keep it from just like smushing together on the back seat as you're driving and stopping and starting and turning, which can quickly create like a tossed salad of just stuff in the back seat of your car, I use plastic storage bins to keep myself organized. This ended up working out really well for me. Instead of labeling them with what was actually inside the bin, I decided there was an opportunity here to maybe help deter some people, kind of like with the duct tape trick. What I ended up doing was creating fake labels for all the bins. I wrote on the front side of them something that I thought would not tempt people, or maybe even deter them from possibly breaking into my car. So I kind of tried to pretend that like my car was a car of a college student moving off to school, because generally college students do not have a ton of money and they won't have valuables, or at least an excessive number of valuables in the car. Like they generally don't have fine jewelry or watches, and their tech gear is usually more limited. I was kind of hoping people would look into my car and be like, wow, there's a lot of stuff in that car and none of it's worth breaking in for, is kind of the message that I was trying to send off. So instead of labeling it with what was actually in these bins, I put labels on here like extra bathroom stuff and sophomore year notebooks and other things that I thought people would be like, that's of no value to me to steal. I would write these fake labels really big intentionally in black Sharpie on the labels that I made for the bins so that somebody peeking in could definitely be able to read them. On the back of the labels, because I still want to be an organized person and know what's in my bins, on the back of them I would write what was actually in the bin in just a regular pen so that it wouldn't bleed through the paper. So for example, one of these is eyelashes, one of these is bathing suits. So that way I would still be able to easily tell without opening the bin what was inside, but I still had that label on the outside. My thinking was that these labels would make people less curious about what was going on here when they were peeking inside of my car, and would also help deter them from thinking there's any valuables in the car. Look, I have no way of really knowing if this worked. However, I can just say that within about 10 to 11,000 miles of driving on that trip where I had these bins in some configuration sitting on the backseat of my car, nobody ever broke into my car. So all I can do is speak from experience. I'm sure a lot of this was just kind of timing and luck and other things I was doing to be smart. However, it doesn't take a lot of work to do this, and it definitely, I don't think, hurts you to do it. So maybe something to consider here. My last tip is to trust your gut instincts. If something doesn't feel right, then go with your gut feeling on that. I have an example here for you guys. So I was in Washington State. I was in a pretty remote area camping in a RV park. And I'm also going to mention that there was no service in this campground. So I went to the bathroom and it was already around midnight. There was 3 guys sort of loitering outside of the bathroom, and it was a little bit weird because it's like, well, it's pretty late. Like, what are you guys doing here? Like, they weren't really doing anything. They're just sort of there. As I was in the restroom, I could hear their conversation, and they were like, oh, that girl, like, she's from New Mexico. Like, wow, that's so far away. And it kind of like, I kind of felt like just like a jolt, because I was like, oh my gosh, that means that they watched me walk from my car, like, to the bathroom, and like saw my license plate, saw that it was New Mexico. And that made me so uneasy, just that extra attention and awareness, like, on me, especially because usually people are not awake that late in campgrounds. Like, people kind of get up with the sun and go to bed with the sun because there's not that much to do in the dark. But got out of the bathroom, went immediately back to the car, and I left the campground, even though it was already midnight and I was so tired. First, I tried to sleep in the parking lot of a church, but this church must have an issue with people parking overnight because there were signs everywhere like, we're going to tow you if you park overnight. So that didn't work. So I ended up backtracking like another hour and a half to where I'd slept the previous night because I knew that that would be a safe place to be. By the time I got there, it was almost 2 a.m. and I had a work call the next morning at 8 a.m. So it was a pretty rough night, but I'm really glad I decided to trust my gut instinct there. Like, something just didn't feel right. And although, you know, those men had technically not done anything to me, I just felt uneasy about the whole situation. And in the end, you know, it's not really worth risking your safety. I would have rather lost those couple hours of sleep than risk something weird happening in the night in an area, especially where I don't have service. It would have been impossible to even, you know, call somebody or call 911. You should trust your gut when it comes to these situations. If something doesn't feel right, it's probably not right, and it's probably not worth the risk of trying to ignore that feeling and just kind of override it. And you are smart and you have those instincts for a reason. The last thing I'll say is it's important to realize that a lot of these things that could potentially go wrong on a road trip or when camping or when traveling are things that could happen to you literally at any point in your regular life too. You could get a flat tire in your regular life. You could meet a stranger on a trail and have an uneasy feeling about them if you're hiking in your own hometown. You could, you know, have sleep deprivation affect your life when you're at your own house. There's always going to be a million possible what if scenarios and worst case scenarios that we could play out in our mind. And that goes whether we're talking about regular life or with traveling. For example, that mistake of getting locked out of my car because that one car door that I have just closes so easily so that if it's windy, I'll accidentally get my keys locked inside of the car. That has happened to me in my regular life and also while traveling now. And it's important to remember that these are things that are not necessarily travel specific. I think recognizing that can really help us get over that feeling that traveling is so scary and there's so many risks associated with it. A lot of those risks you could have just as likely happen to you in a more stationary lifestyle. Anyways, let me know what you guys think. Would you ever do a road trip by yourself? Would you ever camp by yourself? Have you done these things before? I'm always curious to hear your guys' experiences, and I want to thank you guys so much for watching another video. Until next time, bye YouTube!